Welcome to the Everything History podcast for episode 59, Ancient Sparta and Thucydides. Last time I covered Athens and how it developed prior to the year 431 BCE, and now in this episode I shall address Sparta and also give some details on the historian Thucydides, who witnessed, participated in, and wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War in the late 5th century BCE.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Sparta, as you likely know, stood in great contrast to Athens, and that is one of the reasons the Peloponnesian War is so deeply interesting. It was a confrontation between the two most powerful Greek city-states, and also a contest between two very different ideologies about how the state is meant to function and how people ought to behave. I perceived myself, however, so allow me to again wind the clock back several hundred years prior to the Peloponnesian War. It is unclear how old Sparta is, and considering how little Sparta built, we will never know for certain. Unlike most cities, however, in Greece, Sparta is specifically mentioned in Homer as existing during the Bronze Age. That is far prior to 1200 BCE. In fact, in Homer's Iliad, Sparta was a primary player in the Trojan War. King Menelaus and the ever-troublesome Helen were both from Sparta. But what truth lies in those tales is quite lost in myth. According to tradition, too, the city of Sparta was founded deep in the Bronze Age by a son of Zeus named Lacedaemon. Whence the Spartans took their name, for their people were and are still known as Lacedaemonians, when they're not known as Spartans, that is. Sparta resided in the southern Peloponnese of Greece, in the surprisingly flat terrain of Laconia, bounded by Greece's mountainous terrain. The name of the terrain Laconia is also directly tied to their people being Lacedaemonians, just as with Attica and the Athenians. As mentioned in the previous episode, Greek city-states were all autonomous and considered themselves to be either Doric or Ionian. The Ionians came from the Aegean Sea, apparently, but the Dorians came from the north. The Doric peoples settled primarily in the mountainous terrain of inland Greece, often each city settling in a plain between Greece's many small mountain ranges. The Peloponnese, accordingly, was largely a Doric area, and the epitome of these conservative Greek-speaking people were the Spartans, otherwise known as the Lacedaemonians. Throughout their history, the Spartans were an agricultural people that actively sought not to change anything. Hyper-conservative, the Spartans were extremely militaristic and very wary of strangers and commerce. For example, the Spartans intentionally refused to produce coinage. They stuck with cumbersome bars of metal because they feared the influence of commerce and how it might change them and the sacred ways of their ancestors. As an aside, before I begin pushing the history forward along a timeline, let me note that every time I read about the Spartans, I feel as if my body produces a little bit more testosterone in order to compensate with them. They were an ultra-masculine people. Even their women were hyper-masculine badasses. But their way of life came at a high price, as you will see, and I ask you to be mindful, to not apply your own morality or sensibilities to these people. Judge them as you please, I don't care about that, but keep your personal beliefs out of it. Judge them only with their historical context in mind. Otherwise you do yourself and the Spartan people a disservice. And I think adhering to such guidelines works for any people in any era. According to tradition, around 700 BCE, the great Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus established the Great Retra, which laid in place the constitution of the Spartans. This fellow, Lycurgus, is quite the legendary figure and may not have existed at all. We really have no idea. Regardless, the Great Retra of Lycurgus bounded Sparta together as a society and established governmental authority for the rest of their history. Most notable, Lycurgus's Retra also limited family influence, curtailed greed, and evidently also even dictated the manner in which Spartans were to speak. They were to speak in short, often pithy, statements that get straight to the point. Overly flamboyant rhetoric was banned for its pointless, excessive nature. They considered such speech a form of greed in itself. The form of Spartan speech is now called laconic, because, remember, the Spartans lived in Laconia. As you might have guessed, the Great Retra laid out the constitution as in a set of traditions of how the Spartan government was to function, and once something was set with the Spartans, it rarely ever changed. That being said, Sparta retained their kings. In fact, they had two kings, and they were elected by the male citizens, but they came from specific families and would serve unto death, which happened often in the violence of warfare. One king had to stay in Sparta, and the other was usually off in the field, leading the army. These kings did not have absolute authority at all, however, for there was a group of 5 magistrates known as ephors that supervised them and the rest of the governmental functions. There were 5 ephors, and they were annually elected. The ephors held great power and led policy concerning foreign affairs, especially the decision to go to war. For example, a majority of the ephors' consent was needed to declare war. They could also impeach a king, and below the kings and the ephors, the Spartans had an assembly called the Gerousia. A geros literally means old man, so Gerousia literally means a group of old men. It is commonly translated, however, as the Council of Elders. The Gerousia made legislation and was made up of the 2 kings and those over 60 that were elected by the male citizens. So as to how the passage of legislation worked in ancient Sparta, well, first, the Gerousia passed retras, and a retra means something close to a proclamation or a charter. And when such retras were passed, they were sent on to another body of officials called the appella. The appella was presided over by an ephor and consisted of all male citizens over 30. The ephor's opinion mattered most, and the rest of the people in the appella voted by rank and status order. In other words, eldest to youngest. The appella almost always passed what the Gerousia sent them, and then the proposition became law. The process of voting in Sparta was described by the Greek poet Tyrtaeus, when he wrote circa 635 BCE, quote, "The kings, whose care is the lovely city of Sparta, shall have the first vote in the council, after them the men of older birth, the elders, and the men shall give their assent to their just ordinances." End quote. The Gerousia, it should be said, also served as a high court, having the ability to give verdict on murder cases and other high-profile matters, and could pass execution or exile on the guilty parties. This included the kings. Now, before I move on from governmental particulars, allow me to point out that this system is quite similar to the Athenian system prior to the reforms of Cleisthenes. The Gerousia resembled the Boule and the Areopagus, the appella resembling the Ecclesia or the Assembly of Athens, and the ephors resembled the archons. This was not unique to them. Many, that is most, Greek city-states held similar systems. Sparta did, of course, keep their kings, however. The great difference that distinguished Sparta from Athens and all others was its culture. As said before, the Lacedaemonians were a military and proud people, so determined and sure of their strength in the field that the Spartans never built a wall to protect their sacred city. Spartan citizens were trained in a process known as the agoge, which translates as upbringing. This upbringing was long and arduous, and began at birth. Children deemed unhealthy after birth were abandoned to die on Mount Taygetus. The Spartans are now infamous for this, but infant exposure was a common practice throughout the ancient world, although the reasons of the Lacedaemonians were more militaristic. Yes, but the necessary pragmatism was widespread. Male children began training for the army at the age of 7. The boys trained in packs and learned to survive and suffer whatever the natural world could conjure. A story my former teacher used to tell us: a Spartan boy stole a fox for food because he and his mates were very hungry, and he was keeping the fox at arm's length to avoid the fierce claws and bite of the fox. But a Spartan man was coming down the path quickly at the boy, so to avoid the disgrace and dishonor of being caught, the boy hid the animal under his tunic. The man and the boy had a nice conversation, but in the meantime the fox was ripping up the boy's innards. But the boy showed no sign of pain. After the conversation, the boy promptly died of his wounds. A rather horrific and odd demonstration of what it meant to be Spartan. At age 20, Spartan males were organized once more into units that lived constantly together, and it is then that they became citizens. In such units they trained almost constantly until after another decade, at the age of 30, the men became acknowledged as equals and were allotted land. Spartan men were encouraged and compelled to marry and bear children during their early training, but not before the age of 18. This rule was flexible, but they really wanted the women in particular to be at least 18 because it was at that age that they would begin bearing the healthiest of children, which is actually pretty practical. In particular, they were encouraged to produce sons, not because of male superiority, but because the army always needed men. After being married and being the age of 30, the Spartan soldiers could remain at home and manage their property and a new family, but they could always be called back to military service until they reached the age of 60. The Spartans also had an elite group of 300 soldiers who had sons to live on, and they were known as the Hippes. Now, Spartan women. They were actually the most free women in all Greece. Spartan women were trained vigorously as well, both to set an example for their children and to help with the trials of childbirth. In fact, on several occasions, Spartan women fought to protect Laconia from invaders, and Spartan women proved to be just as formidable and tough, if not more so, than their male counterparts. For example, the first woman to ever win in the ancient Olympic Games was in fact a princess of Sparta, who was a most impressive horse breeder and professional equestrian named Kyneska. More to my current point, Spartan women could own property and could inherit wealth. In contrast, Athenian citizen women were not even allowed out of the house. except on special occasions, and even then, the presence of a male relative was necessary. Spartan women were also quite famed for their manner of dress. They were known as thigh flashers, and I find that rather hilarious, and they were known as thigh flashers because 1, they had muscular thighs, and 2, they wore revealing tunics. They were so revealing because mobility was always desirable for the Spartans. Lacedaemonian women were also quite educated, and all this freedom was necessary to the Spartans because the women needed to run the household while the men were training at soldiering. This strange militaristic system was sustained by a massive unfree population known as Helots. The Helots were not technically slaves, but pretty dang close. They were inherited servants to the Spartans after the Spartans conquered the other populations of Laconia and Messenia, and subjugated such people to the status of Helots. And that happened early in Spartan history, the 8th and 7th centuries. These Helots worked the majority of the land and served to sustain the Spartan citizen class in their military operations. The Helots could not be sold, and at times gained freedom either through accrued wealth or by volunteering for military service during emergency situations. The astonishing fact regarding the Spartan-Helot relationship is that within the Spartan-controlled territory, only 5% of the population were Spartan citizens, another 15% were free non-citizens, and the remaining 80% were Helots. As you might imagine, the Helots were rarely content with their station, and the Spartans were very paranoid. The fear of a Helot uprising fed into Spartan militarism and their manner of life. In fact, the Spartans even ritually declared war on the Helots every fall to remind themselves of the possibility of insurrection. Helots discovered of disloyalty, or widely suspected of it, were killed ruthlessly. The Spartan paranoia also prompted them to keep their army nearby, curtailing any desire to move too far abroad on land or sea. Much like Athens, Spartan power grew immensely over the 6th century BCE, ramping up just before the Persian Wars and the Classical Era. The Classical Era being 500 or 480, depending on who you ask, to 323 BCE, that is, the death of Alexander. Sparta was the traditional power in Greece, both because they were traditional in the conservative sense and because they were the predominant power due to their military might and their prowess on the field of battle. Regardless, they certainly saw themselves as the best, and they absolutely dominated the Peloponnesus and its politics. This became obvious in 546 BC when the Spartans defeated Argos, and they also expelled tyrants from Corinth, Sicyon, and Megara in the 6th century as well. All this was done for the purpose of protecting their own Spartan interests. It was across the 6th century BCE that Sparta slowly began to construct its series of defensive alliances that became the Peloponnesian League. The alliances dictated that if any member were attacked, then the others would come to their aid. Sparta was the clear leader, but they rarely abused the league, unlike Athens with its Delian League. Sparta's power in the southern Greek peninsula of the Peloponnese is paramount to their eventual conflict with Athens in the late 5th century BCE. The full reasons will be addressed in the next episode, but now I must provide some information on the great Thucydides. I hope you have heard the name. Thucydides is the man who wrote the very important primary source work, The History of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides was an Athenian, born circa 460 BCE, and he actually fought and lived through the majority of the war. He was even appointed as strategos, that is, general, in 424 BCE, but was exiled for his failure to keep Amphipolis out of Spartan hands, although the city had already been captured by the time Thucydides arrived. So not really his fault. The fact that he was there and often firsthand is remarkable and makes his work a vital piece of human knowledge. He wrote his work naturally during the war itself, and intentionally wrote it for posterity. He in fact begins his history detailing his reasoning. He wrote, quote, Thucydides the Athenian wrote the history of the war fought between Athens and Sparta, beginning the account of the very outbreak of the war in the belief that it was going to be a great war, and more worth writing about than any of those which had taken place in the past. My belief was based on the fact that the two sides were at the very height of their power and preparedness. And I saw, too, that the rest of the Hellenic world was committed to one side or the other. Even those who were not immediately engaged were deliberately on the course which were to take them to the latter. This was the greatest disturbance in the history of the Hellenes, affecting also a large part of the non-Hellenic world, and indeed I might also say the whole of mankind. For though I have found it impossible, because of the remoteness in time, to acquire a really precise knowledge of the distant past, or even the history preceding our own period, yet, after looking back into it as far as I can, all the evidence leads me to conclude that these periods were not great periods either in warfare or in anything else. End quote. And he was not wrong, although some scholars rather ridiculously occasionally describe the Peloponnesian War as boring or some other pejorative adjective. That is not true. They mistake boredom for complexity, and the Peloponnesian War was definitely complex. It was not a short and decisive war, but it certainly was momentous. But the aptitude and strength of its combatants prolonged and dragged out the war. Lovers of violence and pitched battles will prefer the story of the Persian Wars, but those interested in foreign and domestic policy, politics, state conflict, morality, and the brutality of prolonged war will have their fix with the Peloponnesian War. Now, as far as Thucydides himself, he was exiled after the Spartan capture of Amphipolis, and he spent his exile traveling and observing, even going to Sparta itself. Thucydides was not the originator of history as a form. That was Herodotus. But true history, as we understand it, began with Thucydides. At least I believe that. Herodotus was a teller of tales, very useful still, but Thucydides, he was a historian. He has arguments, he has sources, he has methodology, and he uses rhetoric to perfection. Famously, well, to Greek scholars anyways, Thucydides used extremely complex Greek at times, but notably, he did this on purpose, not to show off, but to force his readers to concentrate on that challenging passage. And yes, I will be reading his history and posting my readings on the Everything History Podcast YouTube page. The themes that Thucydides concentrated on most often were politics, especially conflicting politics within and between city-states, military power as a concept, and the distinction between naval powers and land powers. Accordingly, Thucydides is also one of the first political scientists and theorists, and if you listen to the upcoming readings, you will find that Thucydides often quotes very long speeches. Many of these he did witness, but many he did not, so they should not always be considered direct quotations, although Thucydides was clearly meticulous. And Thucydides, after so many years, eventually returned to Athens. But he did not finish his history entirely, although we do have the great bulk. A student of Socrates, Xenophon, wrote a separate history to fill in the gap towards the end of the war, but it is often criticized for its lesser quality. I rather think Xenophon gets a bad rap because he had to follow Thucydides. No one could do that. And he also had to live in the shadow of Plato and Socrates. Little else is known about Thucydides the historian. On the next episode, I will begin where Thucydides began, the causes of the contention. Remember that you can contact me on the podcast Facebook page or at the email address everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.